Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter day.
Welcome to Community Conversations. I'm your host, Steve Mantis, and my guest today is Marcus Powlowski, our Member of Parliament for Thunder Bay, Rainy River. Welcome, Marcus.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
I just want to mention to our audience, we're taping today on January 14th, 2021. We've just had our state of emergency declared here in Ontario around the pandemic. So if you're watching this down the road, you got a little sense of what's going on out in the world. So we're trying to help out, keep you interested and a little bit informed of some of our current events and activities with our guests. And as always, we're always looking for suggestions for guests and topics to cover in the show. You can check us out on Facebook under Community Conversations, and we welcome your feedback. So, Marcus, tell me a little bit about yourself. I know that before you got elected as our member, you were an emergency physician, I believe, and you were known as Dr. Powlowski. Tell me a little bit about your journey, where you got there.
Yeah, as we were talking about before the show, Steve, one of the things that I found interesting about becoming a member of parliament is for the first time in 35 years, nobody calls me doctor. But yeah, I was a doctor for about 35 years doing, I call it acute care medicine. I did probably very little kind of family practice stuff. I kind of gravitated into doing emergency room. The last 15, 17, 18 years, I've been working in emergency room, mostly here. But before that, I did intermittently emergency room here, but worked quite a bit in developing countries. In developing countries, doctors who are GPs, if they're any good, have to be able to do a lot of other things. So to be able to do surgery, give anesthetics. When I lived in the South Pacific, I was the only doctor for 30,000 people. I was the only doctor that people could access, for example, at night. So if I had to operate on somebody, then I had to turn on the generator, zero the sparks on my cautery machine, give the anesthetic, do the cesarean section, look after the baby, then turn off the generator. And so you're really a jack of all trades in those places. But I did that for 7 years working in developing countries. And somewhere along the line there, I went back and went to law school and then worked for a few years for World Health Organization, writing health legislation. And subsequent to that, I also have a couple of other master's degrees in law, in global health law, and also in public health and health law and policy. So, but as of the last number of years, it's been emergency room work, although I've periodically lectured in the university here, once in the University of San Francisco, in either global health or global health law.
So, and did you grow up in Thunder Bay?
Yes, and I think, and I have a good connection with Fort William. My grandparents came to Fort William from the Ukraine. My father was born there. My mother is English and met my father at art school. My parents ran Strawberry Hill. I don't know if you know Strawberry Hill. So that's my claim to fame. But my grandmother owned a confectionery on Brock Street, and the first years of my life were spent on Brock Street. And my grandfather used to work for CP Rail as a lineman.
Well, I have been neighbors with your folks out here in Kaministiquia. So yeah.
Oh, I didn't know you're in Kaministiquia. Yeah, so I grew up in Kaministiquia. So Kaministiquia is actually split between my riding and Patty's. Once you go over across the river, it's my riding. This side of the river is Patty's riding. But yeah, I grew up mostly in Kaministiquia.
So you got an extensive background in both health and law, covering a wide range of health. Why the heck did you get involved in politics? What was your goals there?
Well, my first motivation to become involved with politics, I think, came from working in developing countries where there's absolutely inequality in Canada and there's absolutely injustice in Canada, but it's dwarfed by the inequality and injustice that happens globally. And when you work in a country and see kids dying from lack of vaccines, or kids who've had their legs blown off or killed by landmines, what's the answer to this? The answer to a kid having their arm blown off by a landmine medically is to formalize the amputation, but that is not a satisfying resolution. In my mind, like, what the hell are we doing making landmines? What are countries doing exporting landmines? What are countries doing allowing this to continue to have children dying from inadvertently stepping on landmines or blowing themselves up? But I mean, that's probably the most graphic example of injustice. But how do you address that injustice? Certainly, as a doctor, you really can't and don't. And so I at the time when I was in Africa and seeing some of these things, my wife was in law school at the time, and some of the things she was doing in terms of public international law seemed like it was more relevant and more value in changing the world than what I was doing as a doctor. So I went back and went to law school. And actually, interestingly enough, when I got back from Africa, a friend of the family suggested I speak to Stephen Lewis, who was then, I think, the ambassador at the UN. And I kind of said,
Right.
well, why would Stephen Lewis want to talk to me? I mean, I was a nobody, I was a doctor. And I said, oh, well, okay, I'll try phoning him. And he was fantastic. He spent about like an hour talking to me and encouraging me and saying, yeah, we need people. And basically, because the question was, is it worth it? I mean, can we change the world? In the political realm, is it worth going into? And he seemed to think yes, it was. I'm finding out whether it was or what. I think I agree with him, but
Well, Stephen Lewis is one of my heroes, and I think the long game is one of his strengths. Is knowing that maybe we can change the world, but it's not going to happen overnight.
yeah, no, there's there's a book that I thought was really great, and I'm trying to remember the author of it, but it, one of the bottom lines is change is incremental, and change occurs slowly, and occasionally there's monumental changes that occur in society, but for the most part, society changes slowly.
And so, I've interviewed a number of our political leaders, and almost everyone says they want to see change and make it a better community. Specifically, what kind of changes would you like to see?
Oh, that's a big question. I don't know. I don't even know where to start. And it's changed since I went into politics. And
Mhm.
I mean, a lot of the international stuff is what interested me. But as the member of parliament for Thunder Bay, your obligation is to your constituents. So, for example, I've ended up getting involved in a lot of medical issues, even though I really wasn't that interested in becoming involved in medical issues. But because of my background in medicine, a lot of different groups come to me because they think and they want things to be done different medically. And certainly with COVID, there's been innumerable issues that have come up related to COVID, because that's been such an all dominating issue in our society over the last 10 months. And so many of the issues that I've been trying to address have been related to COVID or to medical things. Recently, it was medical assistance in dying. There's other people coming to me with things about national guidelines on breast screening. I mean, things that um, beforehand I wouldn't have said, well, here's where I want to change the world. But being a member of parliament, people bring things to you, and ask for your assistance, and then you pick and choose which of those things. So and things I want to change. One of the things, and I think I've kind of learned a bit in politics, is in the Maslow hierarchy of needs in terms of politics. Jobs have to be maybe at the top of the pyramid. So for me, that's been a really important thing, is to try to either maintain what jobs we now have in Thunder Bay, or try to help to create more jobs. Because if you look at the underlying problems in Thunder Bay, whether it's overdoses, where we're provincially the capital of overdose deaths in Ontario, or murder rate, which we're been number one for, I don't know, 5 of the last 7 years or something. And you look at how do we address these problems. I think probably one of the most important ways of addressing these problems is through addressing poverty, because I think poverty is the source of a lot of health problems, but it's the source of a lot of other societal problems. And certainly not having jobs is fundamental in terms of addressing poverty. And so in terms of what I want for Thunder Bay, and what I try to do for Thunder Bay, keeping those jobs at the local Bombardier plant has been very important, because they are our biggest private employer. So that has been one of my priorities. So there's kind of all kinds of priorities, and it's your job, just like it's your job as a doctor. When people come to you with their medical problems, you have to kind of prioritize. And same within the emergency room, you have people who are really sick, and you have people who have fairly minor things, and you have to decide who you're going to. Obviously, you have to address the serious things first, and you have to take the time with the serious things, but then you eventually get to the less serious things. But I think similarly in politics, because there's so many issues in terms of what do you want to change. There's big issues, there's little issues, and sometimes the most you do as a politician perhaps isn't always addressing the big issues, it's addressing the little issues, addressing people who are having problems with getting their relative into the country, or people who aren't accessing their EI benefits, or people who aren't accessing other forms of things they're entitled to, people where Revenue Canada is screwing up on their taxes. So providing some help in these kind of things often maybe amounts to more than sometimes the big picture things, which sometimes are either sink or swim, where it either happens or it doesn't happen at all. And when it doesn't happen, you can end up spending a lot of time involved in something that ultimately helps nobody. So 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 in terms of what do you want to change, there's big things, there's little things, there's many things.
Well, I've got a keen interest in some of the issues you've raised, certainly the issue of poverty, the issue of employment, and the inequalities in our society. And, so when I think about it, I kind of go, okay, when we delve into some of these issues, we see over the last 30, 40 years, there's been a real shift in our society after World War II in the 50s and 60s, and even into the 70s. We saw a consensus on better working conditions, higher wages, more support in the public sector. And we got a lot of our public programs around unemployment insurance and OHIP and many of the public services. But the last 30, 40 years, there's been a move to cut back on those things. And as a result, we've seen lower wages on average for workers, more precarious employment. We've seen greater inequality. You know, those few people at the top are able to keep more and more of their wealth. I mean, we looked at 50 years ago, corporations paid 2 or 3 times what they pay now in terms of percentage of their profit. And there's been a shift that more of that public dollars are dependent upon the individuals. So those are some of the big challenges. And so I salute you, you know, when you talk about saving those good jobs at Bombardier. But a lot of those folks that aren't able to get those good jobs. So how do you see the role of government and your party in addressing those issues of that you've raised of poverty and those inequalities? How do we do that?
Well, it's a big question, but the government the government can't do everything, and certainly if you look at um, what has brought people out of poverty, um, often that's the economy and business rather than government intervention. So, for example, you look at China and how far China came in a number of years. Now, I certainly am aware that there's a lot of government control over the economy in China, but also it has been his industry, has been business that's created the prosperity. And similarly, in Thunder Bay, and you look, how can we make a better life for people in Thunder Bay? Well, some of it and a lot of it, the market does that for you, and this may sound a little unusual coming from a liberal, but I do believe that the free market does bring good things and prosperity and our living conditions in places like Thunder Bay, which I think really have for the most part improved over the years. Like and I think I'm not sure if you're from here. You asked me if I was from here. I am, but growing up as a kid, you know, there wasn't we practically never went to a restaurant. um Shows nowadays, you know, a lot of people, they eat out all the time at restaurants. People have a lot more disposable income. Almost everybody has 2 cars. We just had like one old junky TV. So I think people have in society, and your average person is better off now than they were 30 or 40 years ago. I think that's largely, um, to some extent, not due to any form of government intervention. It's a result of the economy, and I think the global economy, and that's something that, especially under COVID, is kind of taken a bit of a backseat. But I think the global economy has been something that's assisted us, particularly in Thunder Bay, where we exploit natural resources, trees, minerals, grain, and that's been because of our global engagement that we've got money back that's come into our economy. And we've kind of forgotten that. I remember there was a movie with what's his name? What's the movie's name? I'm trying to think the guy's name. The actor, um, Bogart.
Humphrey Bogart?
Humphrey Bogart in the movie had the name Stephanie or something, was the name of a woman. And in the movie, Humphrey Bogart's the brother to Stephanie or whatever's husband, and there's kind of a relationship between the two. But Humphrey Bogart in the movie is the owner of a factory, and she's kind of a little more socialist and is kind of disparaging towards Humphrey Bogart and being the owner of the factory. And he gives this little speech somewhere in the movie for about a minute or something, where he's very passionate about how he said, before our company came here, kids didn't have shoes on their feet. Before our company came here, people couldn't afford to buy books for their kids. Because we came here and we set up this factory, we gave them a source of employment. People have money to be able to buy their kids shoes, to be able to go to the supermarket and buy food, all that kind of thing. And we have, I think, um, I think to some extent wrongly given a bad name to business, in that business in the free market has resulted in greater prosperity for all of our economy. Now, having said that, the market doesn't work all the time and you need government intervention. And for infrastructure, for example, the business will not build the streets, it will not provide the water mains and things like that. In unfettered business isn't necessarily good for us. I'm dealing with that now in terms of pharmaceuticals and pharmaceuticals attempts to push back our attempts to control the price of patented drugs. Well, some of these pharmaceuticals have not, in my mind, been acting at all ethically. But again, it's unbridled. Free enterprise isn't always a good thing. So the government has to be there, in my opinion, to rein in sometimes free enterprise. And I think also there's a valid role for government to stimulate the economy, to try to create jobs, to try to create conditions that will result in ongoing prosperity. So I'll give you an example. Maybe my parents won't like me saying this, but early on with Strawberry Hill, I guess the government gave them, we talked about earlier, my parents ran Strawberry Hill, the pottery, did very well. At the end, when it closed, was employing, I think, 6 people full time. Certainly helped put me through medical school and things. But early on, they got a few $1,000s, because that was back in the 60s, from the government to start up the business. Now, that's government money, right? And I think conservatives and people would say, well, the government shouldn't be taking that role. But because the government spent that money, it created the business, which my parents made money. They spent that money in Thunder Bay. They employed people who spent that money in Thunder Bay, and they paid probably like 100 times that initial government investment back to the government in taxes. So, and I think in my role as a member of parliament is to, where you can, to bring that government assistance to help people get started in business, where without that assistance, maybe they wouldn't. But it brings long-term payoffs to the government and to society to make that investment. And we've seen that similarly with COVID, that and I think that's the government's kind of figuring in investing in things like the wage subsidy and the Canadian emergency business accounts and all these kind of things, because we think, and rightly, that putting a bit of money into companies now to keep them viable is in our economic best interest, because we'll get that money back, because like it or not, the government will continue to tax you. And so so anyhow, I know that's a long-winded question, but in terms of like government involvement in making in bringing prosperity to the people, this certainly is a big issue, and the government's done it by other ways. For example, like the Canadian Child Benefit, which goes now to all Canadians, which has helped. And the government, the Liberal government, has made an attempt to try to increase the size of the middle class. By that, I'm pretty sure they mean by bringing people from the lower income levels up to middle income levels, rather than from higher income levels down to middle income levels. So, but through things
Well,
like the child benefit.
Well, I think the child benefit has shown to bring a number of families out of the poverty piece, and I definitely congratulate the government on that. We just have about a minute left, Marcus, and so the interaction of the government and that free market, how do you pick and choose which jobs and which industries to support going forward that fit into the larger agenda? So people are talking about the new kind of Green Deal or building back better that would address both the issue of jobs and, for instance, climate change. How do you deal with that stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I mean, historically, Thunder Bay has been here because of a resource-based economy, mines, forestry, um, being a port, and being a transshipment point. But in the long terms, and we've seen with closures of the paper mills, for examples, that being too heavily dependent on one source of jobs isn't in our economic best interest. So we have to diversify. And the other thing in Thunder Bay, we're pretty isolated here. So it's not like, I mean, if you're down in Kitchener or Waterloo or Toronto, or you can go drive 100 miles away and find another job. But in Thunder Bay, and a lot of people, I think, rightly want to stay in Thunder Bay, we need to have that economic diversification. The other thing is, you've mentioned the green economy. That's the way the world's going. I think everyone seems to agree upon that. It's a necessity. We have to address climate change, and the jobs related to that are likely to be long-term jobs. So where we can, to try to attract green industry, and companies that are involved in making green products, environmentally friendly products, is, and I know, I mean, I don't want to sound like and there might be some kind of like sounding like you're what, an old hippie from Gillies or something talking like this, but this is, I think, also what we need economically to keep the jobs, because I think jobs in those areas are sustainable, and that there is going to be, and there already is, an increasing demand for those kind of services in our economy. So I think that is what the government is looking to in the next coming years, in terms of job creation, where possible, to use science and innovation, especially with green technology, to create jobs.
Marcus, thank you so much. We're pretty much out of time. Now, if people want to get in touch with you in your office, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, and I'm your member of parliament, and I certainly appreciate the fact that that I have a duty to you all out there. So you can, and I think you're going to post it on your screen, a number you can contact me, the email address. But certainly, if you're having problems with any government programs, if you have ideas, and that's the way democracy works. I mean, you come to me with an idea. I mean, I can't do everything, but some ideas I'll like, and I'll say, hey, yeah, it's worth pursuing. So get a hold of me at the numbers through my office, and I do talk to people and phone them back, but I warn you, sometimes with so much work, it takes a while. But if you do end up talking to me, you'll probably find I'm pretty long-winded, so you may regret it.
Well, I don't regret a minute of it myself, and I'm sure my viewers will appreciate it as well. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I want to remind our viewers that you can check us out both through the Facebook page, Community Conversations, and we post these shows on YouTube afterwards as well. So thanks again so much, our Member of Parliament for Thunder Bay Rainy River, Marcus Powlowski, and stay safe to all of our viewers and community members out there. Take care.
Thanks, Steve.
Working together to make a better community. We can create a brighter day.